So, Eurasia, that great rival of Oceania, the superstate in-universe headed by Big Brother. How did this colossal transcontinental empire come into being? Surprisingly, we know quite a bit about how the superpowers of the 1984 universe came into being. This knowledge gleaned from the lore itself, but also history, common sense, and probability. Of course, while much of what follows can strictly be classed as educated speculation, my thoughts are anchored to what we do know in the lore. First things first, we know that Eurasia almost certainly formed before Oceania, and that it was essentially the absorption of Europe by the Soviet Union. Goldstein's book states as much, quote, "With the absorption of Europe by Russia, and of the British Empire by the United States, two of the three existing powers, Eurasia and Oceania, were effectively in being." Note the listing order. Orwell places Eurasia before Oceania. This doesn't appear random either, as he goes on to describe the geographical boundaries of each power, again beginning with Eurasia and then Oceania. These two larger powers emerged around the middle of the 20th century, as the language says. East Asia, whose origins we'll likely take a closer look at another time, emerged a little later on, by the 1960s, after a period of confused fighting. Other information from the novel does help to pinpoint our timing. The Atomic War was the great event in universe that enabled the rise of all the powers. We know this was ongoing at least, if not wholly confined to, the year of 1954. Winston says the land near the church tower hideout was struck by a nuke 30 years before, giving us this year. Another key bit of information we have is that it was countries who fought the atomic war, not the superpowers. And since only the major powers, like the US and Soviet Union, would possess nukes, we can say these at least primarily fought it, and that Britain and the Western European powers likely sided with the US. Colchester was hit, and Goldstein's book informs us that industrial centres were chiefly hit by hundreds of bombs in North America, Western Europe, and European Russia. We also learn that following an exchange, the ruling groups of the countries ceased using nukes for fear of ending civilization, and hence their own power. Since we have a definite year of 1954, and we also have a definite year of the party in power within Oceania, which is by 1958, this neatly narrows the range of superpower formation within this 4-year time period. For those who haven't watched the "When Did the Party Seize Power" video, we know 1958 was a base year of power by working our way back from the 9th 3-year plan date referenced in Part 1, Chapter 4. Before the Atomic War, Winston informs us in Part 1, Chapter 3 that there had been a, quote, fairly long interval of peace during his childhood. Unfortunately, we cannot with absolute certainty say this air raid was the start of the Atomic War, though I incline to this being the case, as Winston does say, quote, "Perhaps it was the time when the atomic bomb had fallen on Colchester." There is that small element of doubt though. Luckily, since there's no ambiguity in his comment about the nuke falling near the church 30 years before, we can roughly corroborate the timing. We know Winston is 39, so he has a birth year of 1944 or 45. If this memory was around 1954, then this made him about 10 or 11. The comment of the old man is key for me, the "we didn't ought to have trusted 'em" comment, which heavily implies the Soviet Union, though in fairness it could be interpreted other ways too. Since we're pre-war, we know it can't be the party, so the natural suspect would be the Soviets. This also makes sense, as they were wartime allies and frosty but peaceful rivals up to this point in our world. So now we have our timings and the broad order of events. What likely happened? Well, obviously the Cold War turned hot somehow. Since Orwell was writing the novel in around 1948, he was in the mindset of the war that had only ended 3 years before. We can look back at various hotspots and speculate on alternative history scenarios. A possibility I've mentioned in previous talks was Operation Unthinkable. However, since we know there was a period of peace For around a decade after the Second World War, this would have been beyond what Churchill envisioned. By the 1954 time, the Soviets would have been heavily entrenched in Eastern Europe and East Germany, supported by friendly regimes. Another possibility is that the war itself panned out a little differently. Certainly, if US involvement in Europe was delayed somehow, the Soviets may have pushed further into Western Europe, perhaps not only taking Berlin, but moving into the rest of Germany, and then into eastern France, all of Austria and the Low Countries. Given war exhaustion, supply difficulties, and the likelihood of angering any Western Allied presence there was in Europe, I find it unlikely the Soviets could have crossed the Pyrenees at this point to attack Francoist Spain. While a greater Soviet sphere is possible then, would a Eurasia-like conquest of all of Europe have been possible? I suspect that the Soviets perhaps were more successful in this timeline, and this increased tensions when the Brits and Americans did push into Europe. Maybe large parts of France, Switzerland, Belgium and Italy are still free, along with Spain. This uneasy situation then persisted for some years throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. Simpler still, perhaps territories were exactly as they were in our world, but that a Checkpoint Charlie or other hot event was the spark that initiated a Soviet push into the remaining parts of Europe, not under their control. Since we know the Soviets were victorious in Europe, the Allies must have been defeated or forced to withdraw, likely to Britain itself. We know the atomic war was catastrophic for all powers, the novel reading, quote, "The ravages of the atomic war of the 1950s have never been fully repaired." Given this, we must conclude that the Soviet advantage in manpower simply tipped the balance, allowing them to overrun the rest of Western Europe. From around 1954 and by 1957 or 8, at the very latest, the Soviet Union took any parts of France, Switzerland, the Low Countries and any remaining holdouts, before moving into Spain and likely taking their revenge on Franco for the loss of their Republican allies in the Civil War. Franco would have fled or been destroyed. Perhaps around the same time, the Red Army also breached the Alps, streaming into northern Italy and seizing all the ancient cities there. Milan, Venice, with their rich historic buildings, art and culture, would all fall into communist hands. A huge symbolic victory would be the taking of Rome herself, the ancient mother of cities. Stalin, or if he died, his successor, would now be counted among the other great conquerors of the Eternal City, among them Sulla, Caesar and Alaric. The Pope would have either fled or been seized, he and his leading cardinals disappearing into a cell somewhere, perhaps only re-emerging after a few years of re-education. Given the timescale we're looking at, the Eurasian conquest would be nothing less than stunning, assuming territories were the same in our world post-World War II. We're talking about the fall of France and the Western European nations, Scandinavia, Spain, Italy and even Turkey, as well as likely portions of the Middle East and, at least initially, North Africa too. Such a rapid conquest only really has parallels with perhaps Alexander's rapid conquests. Given the timing, this all likely happened in a couple of chaotic years between 1954 and 1957. If the party were in power by 58 at a minimum, then the Neo-Bolsheviks must have been in power in Eurasia before this. 1956 or 57 seems a reasonable founding year. One event that could very well have triggered the changing of the elite, or so-called high in the new Eurasia, could have been Stalin's death. In our world, Stalin died in March of 53, not too far off of our atomic war year. Orwell obviously predeceased the Soviet dictator, passing away in 1950, so perhaps he envisioned the old dictator holding on until the middle of the decade. With Stalin's iron grip loosened, this would have seen a scramble for power. We know this, as this is precisely what happened in our world. Of course, in-universe, this shift was far more radical. Khrushchev likely never succeeded, or any of his fellow contenders, or maybe one of them pushed in a very different direction. Could this be a Beria-controlled Eurasia, for example? The main reasons I tend to believe it was an entirely new faction that seized power in Eurasia is that this is what the law tells us, and because the atomic war likely allowed this radical new movement to rise in response to the ruling regime's perceived incompetence in managing the atomic war. In Oceania, we know the usual cycle of the middle supplanting the high took place one last time before the new high, the inner party, determined that history would henceforth be frozen, ensuring their absolute power forever. The same seems to have occurred in Eurasia. We know the type of people who were the new elite in Oceania: teachers, politicians, scientists, managers, and others, more from the middle and upper grades of the working classes. In Eurasia, then, I think large elements of the military, perhaps many middle-ranking officers, as well as many professional types aforementioned, coalesced in the chaos of the war to form an opposition to the Bolsheviks. Given the name too, I think the surface premise of the movement may have been an adherence to true communism, which of course was just as vacuous as the English socialists' apparent adherence to socialist principles. The Neo-Bolsheviks perhaps fought their own civil war in a similar way the party rose to power in Oceania, finally ousting the old Stalinist regime and seizing power. This must have occurred before the middle of '58, more likely a year or two before. In response to the rise of Eurasia as a declared power, the United States either peacefully or forcefully absorbed the British Empire and, if the claimed extent of Oceania is to be believed, likely fought their own campaigns in South America and other areas. I like to imagine that Oceania formed as a NATO-like entity in response to Eurasia and quickly morphed into the superpower we know as an expedient of survival. So Eurasia rose in the 1954 to 57 period, following the outbreak of the atomic war. Eurasia as a power was certainly established by 1958, and the language of Goldstein's book heavily implies Eurasia formed first, and we know Oceania existed and was party-run by 1958. More likely, Eurasia under the Neo-Bolsheviks was a reality a little earlier in 1957 or even 56. The most likely course of events, or at least a plausible one for me, is that Stalin's death triggered a leadership vacuum and enabled, in the general chaos of the wars of conquest and nuclear aftermath, the Neo-Bolsheviks to rise and seize power, finally arresting the flow of history in their domain. Of course, any number of things could have triggered civil war and the rise of the Neo-Bolsheviks too. Perhaps you have your own theories on how and when both Eurasia and the Neo-Bolsheviks rose and seized power respectively. Tell us all in the comments section, and remember, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength.